Now that we've set up both servers for LDAP, let's look at migrating local users from etc password to the LDAP master server, which will of course subsequently replicate the items to the secondary servers. So in this section we cover migration from local etc password to LDAP. Migration of local accounts, which basically means etc password, to LDAP. Now there are a series of tools. They happen to be Perl scripts that we can download from online, from paddle.com, the folks who have written the NSS and PAM modules for LDAP. They provide a series of Perl scripts which we can download to take advantage of. Those Perl scripts will query your local databases such as etc password services, protocols, and the like, and turn them or render them into LDAP form. So features include ability to migrate users from flat files or users/records from flat files to LDAP. We mention records because we're not only limited to users but also groups, services, protocols, and the like. And we download the scripts from the following URL. That's paddle.com OSS migration tools.html. And as we've mentioned, these are the folks of PAM underscore LDAP SO and NSS underscore LDAP.SO. So when we confirm the installation of PAM and NSS modules earlier, we're referencing modules that are supplied to the open source community by the makers of these free scripts that we can download. So the Paddle folks are responsible for those scripts, as well as the modules that we use across Linux distributions to interface to LDAP from PAM as well as from the name service switch. So our tasks include download and extract scripts, create local users on SUSE and RH5 boxes. We could also on Solaris. The Perl scripts also work on Solaris. And then 3, migrate those users to LDAP. Beginning with the first task, let's navigate to the website in our browser. We'll pull up an instance here. And this takes us out. We'll just stop it in its tracks so it doesn't download the full page. And then navigate to the Paddle website. On this page we find the scripts that we're interested in. And we also see some instructions regarding the key variables that are to be updated prior to execution of the scripts, such as the default mail domain, as this gets included in many of the conversions, the default base, which for us is DC equals linuxcbt, DC equals internal, whether or not extended schema support should be enabled for users, and this depends on having the schemas inet.org person and organizational person available to your LDAP environment, and various other items. Now towards the bottom of the page we see the links for the scripts either via FTP or HTTP. We also see additional documentation regarding how we should execute the scripts. For example, there is a shell script which will migrate all of your flat files if LDAP is up and running, and that's migrate underscore all underscore online.sh. There's also an offline version, again if the server is offline. If you use NetInfo or NIS, Yellow Pages, then there are scripts for those environments as well. And there are also distinct scripts per table or per database. So we will be using the distinct scripts instead of focusing on all of the scripts. Let's get the URL now. We can use wget to pull this, so we'll just right button, copy link location, and set up a directory on linuxcbt SUSE2. Let's find a window with SUSE2, which is the primary server. and none of these windows are open to that remote system, so we'll open one here. Let's SSH to Linux CBT SUSE 2, then navigate into temp once it's up. It doesn't exist, so we'll make direct. In fact, let's store it under LDAP. We'll make directory paddle, and then wget the script tgz image into this directory. Now here we see that it has failed to resolve paddle.com, so perhaps we should pull it from our browser and copy it across. The DNS may not be properly configured. Let's save it to disk, and it's downloaded very quickly into our desktop directory beneath our home directory. So let's find it on the local system. We'll find an instance of Linux CBT SUSE 1. Here it is. And if we navigate to desktop, we'll find migrationtools.tg. So let's scp migrationtools.tgz as root over to Linux CBT SUSE 2 into the LDAP subdirectory, into the paddle subdirectory. And now the file's there. Now back to our SUSE 2 instance, we should see it here, and there it is. So a tar, and we'll use tar to gunzip as well as untar this file. A file against it reveals that it's both tarred as well as gzipped. So a tarx zvf will do the trick. And perhaps we should just document this. So we have downloaded it, and then we need to tar xzvf the migrationtools.tgz package. This will create a top-level directory beneath paddle with which we'll navigate into and evaluate the scripts, make the changes to the default, and move forward with migration. So tar xzvf, and as mentioned, it's created a top-level directory. Let's navigate into it, migrationtools-47. And these are the scripts we alluded to earlier. There are distinct scripts per table or per database, such as RPC, protocols, profile, password, which is what we'll be looking at, networks, netgroup, hosts, and others. There are also aggregate scripts such as migrate all, whether online or offline, or whether using NIS or NIS plus. Migrate aliases, etc. Now, all of these scripts reference a common config file, migrate_common.ph. And by the way, these scripts are also included with Solaris, with the OpenLDAP distribution of Solaris. So it's in the user directory on Solaris, so you can make use of it there. And it's also included with Red Hat. But if you don't find it with your distribution, then just download it. So before we create users, let's download, extract, and configure. And configure scripts. So step B for us will be to update the default config file, migrate_common.ph. Now there are a few key variables. You'll see them right away once we navigate into the document. Most of the top section contains comments. There's a conditional section here depending on whether we're running netinfo or standard LDAP. These are the OUs that are created. So there are OU names which can be adjusted that the scripts will create for you. Now here are the important items. The default mail domain. Right now we're not concerned about mail. However, it should reflect, the domain should reflect the domain used for mail within our environment. And usually the domain for mail reflects the LDAP domain. The default base is of most importance. This changes from paddlecom to Linux CBT internal, as the scripts will reference this variable as a means of merging in the root DN information or base DN information. There's some mail entries here for send mail, a default mail host, but again, right now mailing is not of a concern, and whether or not we'd like extended schema support, this depends on whether or not organizational person and inet org person schemas are included. For now, we'll just migrate using standard schema or non-extended schema support, which means we won't have inet.org person attributes for the users that we migrate. Now those are the key entries. The rest includes just typical scripting syntax and lines for processing the entries that are read. Now we need some users to migrate. We do have users if we cat the contents instead of just tailing it etc password. There are many predefined users that come with the operating system. These are daemon and service users, cron, LDAP, so on and so forth. Root, of course, the system user. And there was an Linux CBT LDAP test user that we created. So these users will also be migrated to the people OU, or we'll have the LDIF for importing these users into the people OU momentarily. But how about we create some additional users so that we can easily identify them on a per system basis. So back to our notes, we've configured the script. We should create local users on both boxes. So we will create, let's call the user on the SUSE box LCBT SUSE2 local 1. That will be one user on this local system. And on the Red Hat side, we'll call the user LCBT RH local 1, such that when we import, we can identify the source of the user accounts. So we'll create these users using traditional means. On the SUSE side, that means using YAST. Let's ensure that our SSH session will export xconfig or the xconfiguration x.org. It currently isn't, so let's tack it on. We've exited and we'll tack it on. And once on the remote system, we'll be able to launch YAST2, which will launch a graphical environment, in our x.org environment, and we'll then create, let's just copy into memory in the interim, Linux CBT SUSE2 local 1. This will be a newly created local user as opposed to an LDAP user. We'll navigate to security and users, user management, and this will pop up momentarily. Now, instead of setting the filter to be LDAP user, we want it to be a local user, which is the default filter. Notice a user for my name as well as Linux CBT LDAP test1. Let's click on add. Notice the form differs from the LDAP entry form. And we'll just make the username and full name one and the same with a simple password that SUSE may not agree with, but it'll get us going along the track that we want to be on. Let's finish, and we'll confirm on the remote system using a tail of etc password that the user was indeed created. So let's tail etc password, and indeed Linux CBT LDAP test is after Linux CBT SUSE2 local. But nonetheless, Linux CBT LCBT SUSE2 local was created. Now on the Red Hat side, let's find a window to that particular system. Let's exit and reconnect to be sure that we're connected with xexport, and we are. There are a series of system config utilities as we've alluded to, so once we connect, we'll get that going. This should come up momentarily. And we'll just give it a few seconds here. So system-config, if we tab this out, we see a number of utilities. The one that's of interest is system-config-users. Now certainly we could use standard shell utilities such as UserAdd to add the user, but if we can launch the graphic, why not? So let's launch system-config users. This will pop up the GUI on our end, at which point we'll be able to create the new user. The interface isn't as elaborate as SUSE's YAST, but nonetheless it does a trick. So here are some users, including Linux CBT Corn from recent studies and other users. We'll add a user and copy it from our notes as Linux CBT RH local 1. Again, we're doing this so that when we migrate, we can tag the users that have been migrated from the local user accounts databases on both systems to the shared LDAP database. Again, we'll use a simple password. And you don't have to worry about these credentials traversing the wire through the SSH session as it's encrypted. The default shell will suffice, but if you intend to use a different shell, by all means change it. This creates a private group for the user. and it creates the home directory on the remote side for the user. Let's click OK. So now that user exists on the remote side. We'll close the system config users utility, navigate to the shell, and tail, like we did on the SUSE side, etc password, where we see Linux lcbt rh local 1. So now we've got our 2 local users on both systems, but certainly if we do an LDAP search, these users won't exist. So let's execute LDAP search, and we see a bunch of users, but we don't see, obviously, lcbt rh1. We can even LDAP search grepping for, or using perhaps the cn object to search. So for example, cn equals Linux CBT LDAP2 returns nothing in this particular case, and it's actually Linux CBT LDAP2 user, which returns 1 result. But if we search for LCBT, which should be in our memory, there it is, nothing comes back. So there's no auto procedure or process in place to auto import users from etc password. It doesn't work that way. If you add users to the local user accounts database, that's where they'll be unless you use a process like the tools we've downloaded to migrate those users. So otherwise, the users don't automatically get migrated. So we should just note that. We'll note it beneath the migration section. Note, users created in etc password, which is basically your local user account database, are not auto-magically imported by LDAP. This must be done manually. Or save yourself the headache by creating the user in LDAP in the first place. But nonetheless, mistakes happen, or maybe this was intended and now you want to duplicate the users, have them in both places. So, on to the migrate scripts. Well, let's go back to the shell. We'll begin on the master server Linux CBT SUSE 2. So as we've mentioned, if we navigate into the LDAP subdirectory, into paddle, into migration tools, there are a number of scripts that are available for us to import items or to generate LDIF entries, which we can then subsequently import into the remote system. When you use the shell scripts such as migrate all NIS offline or migrate all online, these scripts will prompt you for the appropriate bind DN, which includes password. But when you use the Perl scripts directly, you must export to an LDIF file. Otherwise, the Perl script will dump to standard out the LDIF format. For example, to migrate these scripts, we'll use migrate password. So our first step will be, let's just create some additional space, to execute // as the current directory is never in the path on Linux systems by default, migrate, and we're migrating password. The migrate base, which is what we almost type, is the utility that creates the base OUs for storing the different tables such as people, group, and others. Migrate password, however, solely focuses on etc password and its corresponding items in shadow. So migrate password PL, and unless we indicate, this will dump everything to the screen. Now, migrate password PL expects an input file. If you don't supply an input file, it will return an error or return its usage information. So that's going to be migrate password PL etc password, and unless we indicate an output file, the results will be dumped to the screen or to standard out. So let's try that from the shell. That's migrate password. Let's try it without etc password, so you see that it expects an in file, and optionally, that's what the brackets mean, it expects an output file. If no brackets, it will dump everything to the screen. So let's try that. So there we see everything dumped to the screen, including the recently created Linux CBT SUSE 2 local 1. Notice the settings are there in the appropriate format. UID, common name, object class, so on and so forth. Had we changed extended schema to 1 from 0, which is the current disabled state, then we would see inet org person and organizational person object classes added, which facilitates obviously additional fields. That's certainly optional, and we can do that for subsequent users. Notice the password. It's also protected using a long string, And by the looks of it, it appears to be MD5, although it reads crypt, which means during our configurations we could have flipped one of the switches to MD5, but that's neither here nor there. The other important items include objects from Shadow, the shell to use, the UID of the user, the GID, and the home directory of the user, and the geckos or description field of the user. But none of this was saved, of course. This was all dumped to the screen. So the important thing to do here is to dump the items to a file. So we want an output file. We'll call that file linuxcbt-susa2.password.ldif. So we know that the password entries came from this particular host. Let's clear screen and give this a run and echo the exit status. And we did not echo it properly. Nonetheless, the file is created, and a less of it will reveal momentarily that it's all ldif. So let's just note this creates an ldif compliant file for import into LDAP. So now step B obviously is to use a traditional means of importing the data into LDAP, such as LDAP add or LDAP modify. So LDAP add, bind dn, which is cn equals manager, dc equals linuxcbt, dc equals internal, followed by any option such as simple authentication, prompt for password, and the name of the file, which will indicate on the command line. So file name or ldif import file. This will import it to the default server, which is the local system. Now these items should be created in the people OU. Notice that for each entry they belong to the people OU. Let's give this a try. And the file name is linuxcbt-susa2. This will prompt us for a password, which it does, and notice it's added all of the entries into the LDAP database. Let's echo the exit status, and it's clean. So it has imported it exactly how we envisioned. Let's just copy the file name so that we have it accurate in our notes. And of course the LDIF file is in your docs subdirectory, although for your environment you should substitute the base DN and other applicable items. So with that said, how do we confirm that these items actually exist? Well, obviously LDAP search. So step C or 3 is to LDAP search, etc., to confirm the new LDAP users from the master LDAP server. Now we've got LDAP search in our history, so let's launch, we'll clear screen, an LDAP search. This searches through all objects. Notice there are now 53 objects, and here we see as the last object linuxcbt LDAP test, which is a user with various entries, and right before that user is lcbt susa2 local 1. Now at this stage we could actually log on to the remote Red Hat box using this linuxcbt or lcbt susa2 local 1. Let's try that out. We'll SSH as lcbt susa2 local 1 at localhost from the current shell as root. That'll suffice. We're prompted to accept the public key into our known_hosts file in the hidden SSH directory in root's home, and let's authenticate using ABC123. And this tells us that, and we wanted to try to log on to the Red Hat side. The SUSE side let us log in, but it didn't auto-create the user's home directory, which is the expected behavior. So let's just note that. Step D, attempt to SSH into both systems using newly created LDAP entry, in this case lcbt susa2 local 1. And we should note SUSE config is not set to auto create users home directory. which explains why we were able to log in. Whoami tells us who we are, but we don't have a home directory, so we're kicked to the root of the file system. We could always rectify that by updating the PAM configuration or by creating the directory structure beneath home as the user root and chowning the permissions, which we'll do in a second. Now let's try connecting to Linux CBT Serve 4, which is the remote system, the Red Hat system. It prompts us. We've already accepted the public key, so no need for that to go again. And now we're over on the remote system as the user Linux CBT SUSE2 local 1. In our home directory, it was auto-created for us, albeit it didn't echo it to the screen, but it was auto-populated for us. Now, the user we created on the Red Hat side has not been imported into LDAP, so we will not be able to find a trace if we use LDAP search with the recent invocation of the user LCBT-RH. It just doesn't come up, so the grep returns a non-zero exit status, which means we need to import the etc password entries using the utilities, or we need to export it to LDIF and using the utilities, and we can then import using LDAP everything over on the Red Hat side, or we can selectively extract just that user, which would save us a lot of time. So for example, over on the remote system, we need the migration tools, so let's get it over there by copying it from the local system. We'll just copy star here over to the remote system. So on Serve 4, let's navigate into LDAP. We'll make a similar directory, paddle, and we'll just copy it into paddle rather than reconfiguring the migrate_common ph file. So that's scp star, and this also has an ADS subdirectory here. That's scp migrate star. Let's copy everything, in fact, over to Linux CBT Serve 4 into the LDAP paddle subdirectory. Now the scripts will be placed on the remote side, and now they exist. Now if we execute migrate password for etc password, this reads through our etc password, but we're interested only in this object. So let's copy the object, and using standard LDAP add with standard in, we'll import it. We can do it from either host. Let's do it from this host. We'll LDAP add bind dn cn equals manager, and remember we mentioned that the bind dn is case insensitive. dc equals Linux CBT and dc equals internal. Simple authentication, prompt for password. We're going to accept the value on standard in. So let's go ahead and add this to the directory. Now this is to be added to the people OU, which is specified in the LDIF entry. Now it's Control-Shift-V, and it has added. Let's echo the exit status. Now we'll kill it. Now we didn't indicate on the command line as a mistake, we didn't indicate the master server, Linux CBT SUSE2. So let's go ahead and rectify that. That's where we want it to be added. Since we're on the remote system, it's easy to get confused unless you really pay attention to the prompt. And Control D, the new entry has been added. So if we query Control D to kill the directory LDAP search, we should see in OU equals people the final entry LCBT RH local 1. There it is, which means we will now be able to log in as this user LCBT RH local 1. Let's try it. We'll SSH as LCBT RH local 1 at localhost. It prompts us for authentication, and we are placed into our home directory. It was auto created for us, and we can try it remotely as well. Let's find that SSH command from our history. Now let's just indicate in our notes what we've done here. So the next step, E, copy paddle migration tools to slave LDAP server. F, export etc password to standard out on slave server. Step G is to use LDAP add with standard in to import LDIF entry for user LCBT RH local 1 into master LDAP servers directory information tree. And step H, test connectivity to both hosts using what we have in memory, SSH. So we've tested to the Red Hat box. How about testing from the Red Hat box to the SUSE box? So instead of SSHing into localhost, let's SSH into Linux CBT SUSE2. We'll have to accept the public key and then authenticate. Now again, we get the could not change directory. Let's rectify that problem. Let's find a root shell on SUSE2. We'll make directory home LCBT SUSE2, and let's get the exact name. By the way, when you are connected, whether from Solaris, Linux, Red Hat Linux, SUSE Linux to LDAP, you can use the getEnt utility to enumerate objects in the directory as well as an etc password, so your user account's database. So note, use getEnt, optionally with password or group, to enumerate available users. And this works whether you're connected to Samba, LDAP, or connect to Active Directory, which is LDAP via Samba, or to standard Open LDAP, or to any user accounts database source. So to determine the users that are available, rather than memorizing them, we'll execute getEnt. And if you're curious, which getEnt tells us it's in user bin, so any user can run it. GetEnt password. This enumerates all of the users we have access to, from the local etc password to the remote LDAP server. And here we see there's a doubling up of users because we've imported users that exist in the local database. But here's the LCBT RH local 1 user. And here we see the LCBT SUSE2 local 1 user. So we want to create these directories on the SUSE box so that there isn't an error when we SSH in. Let's make directory home and then chown the same username dot users, which is a shared group for that path. And let's see, it made it with colon in the previous step. Let's try it again. So now if we lsld home Linux CBT SUSE2 local 1, the permissions are set and the user will be able to log in. Now let's get that final user, the RH local user. And if this display looks a bit confusing, then you can run getEnt and then grep what you're looking for. And you'll see just that entry. Let's make a directory for the user. On the SUSE side, again, the auto creation of directories when a user log in is a PAM feature. So that's something you'd have to enable on the PAM level. Let's chown LCBT RH local 1 dot users and the same path. And that's going to be user home / home Linux CBT RH local 1. So now both directories are in place. LSLD of home LCBT RH local 1 will reveal the user owns a directory outright. So from any system, if we attempt to SSH back in to SUSE2 after having authenticated successfully, it parks us in our home directory. Let's try it as the other user. That's LCBT SUSE2 local 1, and we're in, parked in our home directory. So again, just to recap, we've migrated etc password users from both the SUSE and Red Hat systems. These scripts also work on Solaris. And so we've migrated users from this host as well as this host into LDAP, which is why we have those duplicate daemon accounts for @cron, so on and so forth, which we'll definitely clean up using LDAP delete. With that in mind, and with that in place, we can SSH into either host using an LDAP account now as opposed to distinct user accounts per host. So that's how you migrate your users. If you've got a few to many users in etc password, use the migration tools provided by Paddle. Just make those changes to the migrate_common.ph file and the primary changes for the base DN. Export your users to a text file, clean it up if necessary so that you don't end up with redundant entries in the directory information tree. Then use LDAP add to import the items into your directory information tree.